The annual United Nations General Assembly will unfold this week against a backdrop of crises from the warming planet to economic uncertainty to flaring conflicts that threaten to further entangle the United States in the volatile Middle East. Trade wars, migration, energy supplies, climate change, and the eradication of poverty underpin the basic themes of the 193-member General Assembly agenda. But the actions of the Trump administration, which has sometimes expressed disdain for international institutions like the United Nations, have created a common denominator. All of the major topics that I think people will be talking about in the corridors are related to, what is U.S. policy, said Jeffrey D. Feltman, a veteran American diplomat and former United Nations Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs. Some leaders are not coming, notably Presidents Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir V. Putin of Russia, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu, the embattled Prime Minister of Israel. Also not expected is President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, regarded by the Trump administration and about 50 other governments as an illegitimate leader. But one prominent figure, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, will attend. The Ukrainian leader plans to meet with Mr. Trump amid growing concerns that Mr. Trump had pressured him over American domestic political issues. Some of the biggest moments and confrontations could happen early in the week. Here is what to expect. President Trump, whose penchant for bombast, scaremongering, and diplomatic bombshells are well known, will be surrounded by like-minded company on Tuesday when the speeches begin. Mr. Trump will be preceded by President Jair M. Bolsonaro of Brazil, sometimes called the Mini-Trump, a polarizing figure at home who, like Mr. Trump, dismisses fears about climate change and ridicules critics on Twitter. After Mr. Trump comes President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt, the former general who has come to symbolize the repression of the Arab Spring revolutions, although his appearance was thrown into doubt this past weekend as protests erupted at home. Then comes President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey, an autocrat who has bullied critics and whose government is a leading jailer of journalists. Until recently, speculation abounded that Mr. Trump would make history by meeting with President Hassan Rouhani of Iran. But the September 14 attack on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, which American and Saudi officials blame on Iran, has made such a meeting unlikely at best. American officials are expected to present what they have described as evidence that Iran carried out the attack with drones and cruise missiles. Iran has denied the accusation. Yemen's Houthi rebels, who are supported by Iran in their fight against a Saudi-led coalition that has been bombing their country for more than 4 years, have claimed responsibility. Mr. Rouhani speaks on Wednesday, and he will almost certainly assert that Mr. Trump ignited the cycle of conflict by withdrawing last year from the 2015 nuclear agreement with major powers and reimposing onerous sanctions that are crippling its economy. The United States is trying to build a coalition to deter Iran, even if it is unclear what form such deterrence would take. The General Assembly gives the administration an opportunity to continue to slow-walk a military response in favor of more coalition building and political and economic pressure, said Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The climate crisis is at the top of the General Assembly's agenda. About 60 heads of state plan to speak at the Climate Action Summit on Monday, and officials aim to announce initiatives that include net zero carbon emissions in buildings. The United States has no such plans. Mr. Trump announced in 2017 that he was withdrawing the country from the Paris Agreement on climate change. But some state governors who have formed the United States Climate Alliance said they would attend the summit and meet with other delegations. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin was expected to meet with his Chinese counterparts on the sidelines, suggesting that the administration was seeking to create a more productive atmosphere for resumed trade negotiations after weeks of acrimony. The two governments recently paused their escalating tariff battle. But some administration officials are pushing for Mr. Trump to address other issues considered sensitive by China, including the pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, the repression of Tibetans, and the detentions of more than 1 million Muslims, mostly ethnic Uyghurs. One official said Mr. Trump should at least criticize China for trying to intimidate Uyghur American activists. Mr. Trump has never spoken strongly about human rights, and he has openly expressed admiration for Mr. Xi and other authoritarian leaders. But lawmakers in both parties of Congress are pressuring Mr. Trump to act. Bills on the Uyghurs, Tibet, and Hong Kong are aimed at compelling Mr. Trump and the administration to take harder stands. A protracted feud between Japan and South Korea, rooted in the legacy of Japan's wartime occupation, has led to downgraded trade relations and the end of an intelligence sharing agreement. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea are not expected to meet with each other. Whether Mr. Trump can induce them into a three-way conversation remains unclear. And an objective shared by all three, North Korea's nuclear disarmament, may see little or no progress. While Mr. Moon is expected to urge Mr. Trump to renew his push for diplomacy with North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, no senior North Korean official plans to attend the General Assembly. Foreign ministers from 18 nations in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States, plan to meet on Monday to discuss what can be done regarding Mr. Maduro, who has presided over the biggest economic collapse in Venezuela's history and a regional crisis caused by the exodus of millions of his people. The push will focus on convincing the European Union to expand economic sanctions against Mr. Maduro's loyalists, including freezing assets they have in Europe. The Europeans may also be pressed to penalize smugglers of Venezuelan gold into Europe. Mr. Maduro, who claimed victory in disputed elections last fall, has retained power despite 9 months of demands to resign by a stubborn opposition movement led by the president of Venezuela's parliament, Juan Guaido. Negotiations between the Venezuelan rivals collapsed last week. Mr. Trump and President Erdogan are expected to meet on the sidelines, but the outcome is unclear at best. A range of difficult issues has pit their governments against each other. The Trump administration is considering sanctions to punish Turkey, a fellow NATO member, for buying a Russian S-400 missile defense system instead of American-made Patriots. And Mr. Erdogan has expressed growing anger at the United States over their joint operations in the northern part of war-ravaged Syria that borders Turkey. He says the Americans have failed to establish a safe zone large enough to keep Kurdish fighters out of Turkey, which regards them as terrorist insurgents. On Saturday, Mr. Erdogan warned that his forces would take unilateral actions along the border if the United States did not act by the end of the month. Someone has to speak last in the list of national delegations addressing the General Assembly. This year, that place falls to Afghanistan, just a few weeks after the collapse of talks between the Taliban and the United States that were aimed at ending the 18-year-old war. With national elections slated for next Saturday, President Ashraf Ghani was not expected to attend. Instead, Afghanistan's delegation will be led by Hamdullah Maab, Mr. Ashraf's national security advisor. Mr. Maab infuriated the Trump administration in March, when he predicted the peace talks would not end in peace.